Welcome back, Day Camp friends, to the Day Camp Podcast. I am Andy Pritikin, Director of Liberty Lake in the Philly suburbs of New Jersey.
I'm Sam Thompson from Crystal Lake Park District, Crystal Lake, Illinois.
And I'm Aaron Gluckstein from Camp Robin Hood, located just outside of Toronto, Canada.
We are day camp professionals joining forces to provide a forum for summer camp pros like you to share ideas and best practices across North America and beyond. And speaking of beyond, folks, did you see the latest statistics from our producer, Matt? We are in 41 countries. I have a new Facebook friend from Africa, okay, who sent me a thing. He's all interested. He heard a podcast, all that kind of stuff. 41 countries. That's pretty cool. All right, so for today's podcast, we are joined by Leslie Keller from the TIC camps in Maryland, D.C., and Virginia, as well as Jenna Singer from Camp Satoga and the JCC of Manhattan to discuss with us the ins and outs of gender issues at day camp, talking programming, operations, etc. So I came up through the world of camping in a very gender-specific way. I went to a boys' sleepaway camp. Right. And then when I went to day camp, I grew up in this model that was, worked in a model that was, these are the boys groups, these are the girls groups, and the girls play softball and the boys play basketball. And when we create the programs, we decide, okay, well, 10-year-old girls, we're going to give them a lot of art, and 10-year-old boys, we're going to give them a lot of sports. And that's just what I knew. And then when I decided to start a camp and make it elective based, and kids can choose anything, it just made the world a lot better in my mind. And then I would sort of go and tell my colleagues, throughout the American Camp Association about what I do. And a lot of camps have been around for a long time, and they've been doing things the same way for a long time. And they're sort of stuck in this Leave It to Beaver model of this is the way camp programming should be. And they don't even realize that they're stuck in that thing, right? And when I present the idea to them, it's like I'm giving them, like, I'm speaking another language. They're like, what? Like, how do we even do it? Where do they go to that bathroom? Like all this like stuff. Like they can't fathom that there's unisex bathrooms. Like, I don't understand, right? And I'll tell you that when I started my camp and I started putting all the kids together, I got solicited by a couple of camps to do inter-camp games, right? To play against other camps, kids against kids. And we were like, okay, great. But our teams are going to be co-ed, just so you realize, And they were like aghast again, like, what? No, we can't do that. The boys have to play the boys and the girls have to play the girls. They were like, well, then we ain't playing, So we fielded co-ed teams, and I think we were in this league for like 4 or 5 years, and we won 2 or 3 years with co-ed teams. I had one baseball team where the sister was the catcher and the brother was the pitcher. It was totally cool. So anyway, I think that's pretty neat. I think it's pretty unique in the world of private camping, but yet I stumbled across Jenna Singer at the JCC Camp Satoga when I was helping her as they started their camp, and I found that Jenna, she was like, oh yeah, all my groups are co-ed, and it was like that before I even got here, and that's just the way it is and all that kind of thing. So before we get into that, Jenna, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself, how you got into camping? We call it your camp origin story, sort of like you're an X-Man. Like, how'd you get there?
Awesome. So I grew up outside of Philadelphia, but on the Pennsylvania side, not the Bordentown, New Jersey side, though actually born there, and went to day camp for a number of years, and then went to Camp Timber Tops, which is an all-girls private camp in the Poconos, and I credit camp with making me a person. It's what taught me how to live alongside others, how to play nicely with people, how to understand responsibility, and also gave me a chance to be a little bit outside my comfort zone, or a lot of it outside my comfort zone. As a student, I was always the kid who needed to be right, and maybe still like that a little bit. And I was the student who needed to study hard and really couldn't get outside of that. And when I went to camp, I realized I could have tons of interests. I could try new things. I could be a different kind of person than my classmates knew me as. And camp was a place that taught me how to try and be okay with failure, and try something again the second time or the third time and still be okay with not getting it right. as a young adult, I tried to think about what my passions were and where I was most successful. And camp was always that place. And so when I finished college and found an opportunity that had me working with children and running an after school program, I took it with open arms, and it felt like camp, but after school. The only difference was that my kids were really, really tired when they got to us in the afternoon, and every behavioral issue that could possibly happen happened. And a few years later, the JCC offered me the opportunity to shift full-time into camp. We had a camp here in our building, which is in the middle of Manhattan. And that same summer opened a camp in Rockland County, about 40 minutes north of our building, and lived there for 9 years. And then about 5 years ago, with a number of people's help, we bought a new property and opened a camp out there. This will be our 5th summer in that space, but our 15th out of the city. And it's been the same thing camp offered me as a kid, a chance to try new things, a chance to sometimes fail and have to figure out how to fix it, a chance to work with people who I never thought I would talk to or be able to have ongoing conversation with. Andy and a number of his colleagues at the American Camp Association have been extremely valuable to us in opening our camp, in thinking about it, in being creative, in thinking about how to like kind of get outside of our own bubble. And I also have the support of an amazing organization that has allowed me to be creative and also kind of step outside of the norm, and be thoughtful about both what our kids need and our families need, and to be forward thinking in this area, but also really stick with what we care about. So
that's awesome. So just one thing, let's talk a little bit about the JCC camps in the New York Tri-State area, because I think that it's a unique thing that there's these shared campgrounds that a lot of these camps have to enjoy/endure. Enjoy/endure. So imagine there's these big parks, right? You could describe this, right? There's a big parks, and you each have sort of a corner, right? And then there's shared spaces, right?
Yeah, so we lived on that space for about 9 years. Basically, the way it works is there's a piece of land where we were was a couple hundred acres. There were 6 agencies that were assigned camp spaces on those grounds. Each of us a number of acres that were assigned to us. Parking lot spots, times at the pool. There was a shared pool complex. But they actually all function on their own. Right now, the model is changing on a number of those grounds where they're trying to work on consortiums and group camps, but generally speaking, everyone's still running their own camp and their own model on a shared piece of property. So that was us for 9 years. Now we've thankfully, for a variety of reasons.
Yeah, so let's talk about that. This is interesting. So here's this agency camp, right? This camp run out of a JCC, right? And they now granted, you're a unique JCC, right? Because you got a relatively affluent clientele, and you can get some good donors. And they found a piece of property, what is it, 40 miles away, 30 miles away?
Yeah, 35 miles.
Right. And they were able to raise the money to purchase it. And now they actually own their site. And it is as beautiful as any private camp you've ever seen. It is on the foothills of what mountain range would you say that is?
Harriman State Park.
Yeah, Harriman State Park. I mean, absolutely gorgeous. And I guess the funny part of the story, which I like telling people, is that it was a German Brauhaus. So for years it looked like a 1920 German village, and then the Jewish JCC came on in and took it over, and they've sort of kept a lot of its charm. I think it's got charm. So it's pretty neat. So Jenna, talk to me okay, I'm from, a private camp. Look, Aaron's camp, right? He's got this very forward-thinking camp, yet he's got gender-specific groups, right? Group names and all that, right? It's sort of old school. It was started by a guy in the 50s, right? And it's sort of kept a lot of things. How do you accomplish having co-ed groups and co-ed programming? What are the sort of obstacles that you think a camp would have to sort of, get over?
Right. So I think the easy part for us is that it's never been any other way.
Mm-hmm.
The hardest change is the hardest thing in the world for many people, and certainly in a camp environment where there's traditions and there's so much that comes with the history of a camp program. Change is really, really difficult. I've been very lucky. We never had a change to make. We've been co-ed since we opened. All of our programming, all of our groups have been co-ed since we opened. Generally speaking, the only time our kids separate by gender is when they change for swim, and even that is changing a little bit. And so realistically, we haven't had to necessarily navigate what some would have to think about as far as change. In general, as you mentioned, we're based in New York City, and obviously urban space. A particularly liberal space. And so there is a lot that we come with that's very natural to be in a co-ed space and to be non-gender specific in any way. Also, our building opened in 2002. So I think from just a basic level, our history is a little bit different. And the things that we were already aware of as we opened and started the organization and camps in turn are different than places that opened in the 30s, 40s, 50s, and even in 1980. It's just a very different history and a very different.
Right. So, but let's just talk about the group of kids.
Yes.
Okay. So how big is a group of kids at Satoga?
15 to 16, 15
okay.
to 18.
And let's say there's 8 boys and 8 girls, optimally, right? And then, so what's the makeup of the counselor staff?
Generally 2 of one and 1 of the other. With our youngest kids, we will allow there to be all female staff, but over 6, there's at least 1 male staff member in every group. Ideally, if it's a group of 16 or more, it's 4 staff, so it's 2 and 2.
Gotcha. And what about programming? When you sit there in the off season with your camp directors, thinking about how many times people should get arts and crafts and how many times they should get, basketball, right? Like how do you just try to level it out?
So for us, we look at children, period. Not boys, not girls, and not binary, non-binary. We're dealing with a lot of pieces here, but children. And so what will kids benefit from? Where will our 5-year-olds be most successful? Where will our 8-year-olds be most successful? Where will our 10-year-olds be most successful? How much of that is choice programmatically, and how much of that is instilled into their schedule. And so when we look at it, we have an aspirational arc that helps us figure out what we want every age group to experience as they go through camp overall, and what we want each child to walk away with at the end of year 1 at camp, year 2 at camp, year 3 at camp, and so forth.
Sounds so logical. But if you've never done it before, if you've always done the gender specific thing, it's a hump to get over.
I would say, for us, the biggest thing is talking to our kids. So I spend a lot of time in the off season talking with families and checking in with our kids. And I have the pleasure of seeing many of them in our after school programs and otherwise in the building. And so I stop them in the hallway and say, we're thinking about doing this. Would you enjoy it? We try our best to ask equal numbers of boys and girls so that we're getting as much of a real survey as possible. But sometimes I'll purposely ask the girls how they feel about really intense sport experiences, and the boys how they feel about art experiences, because there are stereotypes that assume one way or the other to see how the kids would react. But realistically, our answer is kids like stuff, and how can we build it to better the experience for the kids?
Yeah, I think that the fears are fabricated in our brains. Anybody that's afraid of doing anything like this, and speaking from somebody that started a camp in an area where there was no camp before, right? My families that come to me, my new families, when they find out that there's boy groups and girl groups, they look at me and they say, why? And 100 years of camping, is that an answer? I get it, school is co-ed, right? I don't understand why camp is, and it's well, they got to get changed and go to this and that. Right. But like you're saying, if you have both genders in the group, staff wise, then you just do your little split there. And then that's it. That resolves everything.
There are certainly moments, and I'm sure someone will mention this later, but there are certainly moments where it does get difficult. There are issues with, development. There are issues with behavior. There are issues with language. There are certain things that a 7 or 8-year-old boy might not want to say or do in front of a 7-year-old girl, and vice versa, especially then when we start to lean into those early tween years and they have different feelings about the opposite gender, and girls develop, generally develop those feelings earlier. All of that definitely plays out from a social dynamic, but from a programmatic standpoint, we really are very confident that children are children. They appreciate and they need certain things, and they learn perhaps differently, but that I don't know that that difference is actually based on gender. I think children learn differently from one another, period.
Yeah.
They enjoy and experience things differently,
Right.
but it doesn't necessarily, it's not one or the other.
And I think that day camps, where most populations of day camps skew younger, right? Then it really should make a difference. But I do believe that you're right, as they get into tweens, right? That there are times that you're going to want to speak to the boys about certain stuff, and there's times you want to speak to girls, and you want to give them the forum for that, right? And you know, you talk to people who work at gender-specific sleepaway camps, right? And I talk about, I mean, you said you yourself went to a girls' sleepaway camp, right? So, I mean, it gives you the ability not to have the pressure of all the, you know, the sort of weird stuff, you know, between, you know, that. So there are benefits. There's no doubt. I talked to Chris Thurber. He works at a boys' private school, right? And he loves the fact that they can sort of just eliminate that variable.
There are certainly times where when there's a difficult moment or when there's something going on that we need to navigate, where we know the conversation may take a turn that will be difficult if both genders are in the room, we will split them and have certain conversations. It's very, very infrequent. It usually is my like 9 and ups or 10 and ups who end up in those conversations. And truthfully, most of those conversations should be one-on-one or small groups anyway, because the stuff that they're working through isn't necessarily appropriate for a group of 15 to be talking about anyway. The other piece that I'll just mention is, you know, sort of this concept, and one that we're dealing with a lot more frequently now, is not just boy and girl, but those who identify as boys and girls, and may identify differently than their body presents, and how we navigate those. And I will say, realistically, it is much, much simpler to have a conversation with a child or a parent about either non-binary or transgender when the groups are mixed. Yeah. Because it's not, you know, having to have a very difficult conversation about a boy who presents or identifies as a girl, and then where do you put them in camp? We simply put them into the group that is there. Yeah,
we're going to circle back to that because we're going to talk about the staff also, because that is a thing. I'm just curious, Sam, in the world of rec camping, of recreation camping, is what Jenna is describing the norm there?
Yes, we've always been co-ed, and I think that through recent years it's gotten better and better with my little guys, that both male and female counselors want to work with the littlest ones now, which is a good good segue. You know, it's progress is what I'm trying to say. So yes, so now when I'm interviewing, I go for the nurture factor or the patience factor more for those little guys, and then when you're going for teen, you're going for the who can be a friend but be firm. Yeah. As you know, so it's more about the age appropriateness of how this person deals best with those ages.
And how do you have both genders staff-wise in groups like Jenna does?
Yes, yes. And you know, we'll have them partner. We don't start off saying, like you said, it's people, it's not, you know, one gender or the other. So I'm not looking to make it a boy and a girl in every group, but it happens to end up that way most of the time. You know, it just is wonderful. I felt like as I was interviewing, the thing I was good at coming into this was asking everybody the same questions. So, you know, do you like art better or outside, you know, sports better? And the follow-up to that question was always, well, you're going to learn both. And you may end up loving something you've never tried before. The thing I wasn't good at, that Leslie will talk about later, is my job descriptions. I didn't realize that some of them were gender biased. And she has a resource for us later on how you can check out your job descriptions to see if there are biases that you didn't realize you had in the descriptions. So.
Interesting. So as far as program, Jenna and Sam, what about like baseball versus softball? What about like things like football? Like are there some gender specific things, and did you leave those for choice periods, or like how do you work that kind of stuff?
Well, you know me, for baseball, we play tennis baseball. because we have a lot of special needs children. So they play baseball with a tennis ball and a tennis racket. So that eliminates the gender factor right there, because it's its own game. So no, I haven't run into too many activities that can't be done together.
So there's an issue that we've had over the past. It has been, and not talking about these gender specific or co-ed groupings, but just attracting enough male staff to have an even distribution of staff, because, and I know a lot of camps have this issue, but you know, the male staff that we do hire want to be, you know, in the sports areas typically, you know, not always, but there's a heavy presence of male staff in those areas. And we actually have many female staff in male group, in, you know, as counselors and supervisors in male, the male specific sections. But if we were to, you know, take a closer look and you know, be more intentional about it, I do worry about you know, being able to attract enough male staff to even it out.
It is a huge problem. I think by nature, for good or bad, we're often seeing more women who want to work with children, period. And so I think we definitely have to think differently and more creatively about where we find our male staff. We offer incentives to all our staff to refer friends. And honestly, I get my best staff as friends of friends, there's no question. This past summer, we had a male staff member who single-handedly staffed his unit. Care deeply about the incentives, but realistically, I think it's about, you know, how you talk about it. I think, you know, to the point about job descriptions, it's huge, both in how they're written and how they're disseminated, and who's getting their hands on them first and who feels a sense of ownership of them. We ask our counselors to rewrite their own job description at some point midway through the summer, and it's very interesting to see the language that they use to describe their responsibilities and sort of the biases that they actually eliminate in their own job descriptions, which was an exercise we did because we knew that they were slightly off. So I think that there are certainly ways, but I agree with you that it is a huge problem and a difficulty that I think all of us are encountering in different ways, whether our groups are multi-gender or not.
I think it's a very interesting exercise, writing your own job description for your people. I like that a lot.
That tells you a lot about what you think your staff's jobs are and what
Never heard about that.
Are.
So the unconscious gender equity thing, that's a great transition to our new friend Leslie here, which, by the way, would it be gender equity issues to offer twice the bonus for finding a staff person if they're male? You don't have to answer that question. Okay. So Leslie, tell us about yourself. Sam introduced us to you, but please tell us about your story.
Sure. I grew up just outside Washington, D.C. I did not actually end up going to camp growing up, but I joined the camp industry in college and just basically never left until I got a full-time job. I currently work at TIC Summer Camp, which is a technology and sports camp in the DC area.
Which, by the way, is the greatest little dichotomy. I love it.
People are like, oh, tech camps, like that's so hot right now. But we've actually been doing it for over 35 years with the same model and with computer programming.
What is the model? So if I'm a kid that goes to a tech sports camp, what is the model?
It is a half day of tech instruction, and we only have 4 kids for every staff member. So it's super individualized. We have coding, robotics, circuits, animation, filmmaking, a bunch of different digital medias that we offer. And they get like very individualized curriculum that is designed to meet them where they're at and follow their interests in technology. And then the other half of the day where we play sports. We just play sports outside and have a good time.
And do you rent facilities for this?
Yes, we lease facilities in and around the DC area.
It's interesting. Yeah. And what does TIC stand for, TIC?
It doesn't really stand for anything. We let kids make it up. It used to stand for Technology Instructional Corporation, but that doesn't sound fun at all. No. So kids will say it means like torturing innocent counselors or the incredible camp.
Or it means we're all going to get tics when we play outside. Right. So that's pretty cool. So tell us about some of the stuff that you've been like sort of researching and you're passionate about now with the gender equity.
Sure. So my other side job has been that I'm a coach for an Ultimate Frisbee high school girls team, and they are just the most amazing athletes. They're completely incredible, and it was very frustrating for me watching the way that they got treated, because like if you're a female athlete, you're already not the norm. Like all of the sports in the sports arena have been very normalized as like the male, like that's why it's like the NBA and the WNBA instead of the MNBA and the WNBA, like the male version of it. It's just like that's what people know, and when you think of sports, that's what you think of, not the women's team. So we have that factor, and then we have the fact that it's Ultimate Frisbee, which I still frequently get asked if that's something that you play with dogs, and it's like no, like it's actually really difficult competitive sport that is a lot of running. It takes a lot of talent.
more so in certain areas, right? Like it's not big in the Northeast, right? In the New York, New Jersey area, you don't see it very much. But I have a friend down in Texas, and it's the biggest thing in the world.
Yeah.
So
there's the West Coast. Actually, Massachusetts is a pretty big hotbed, in DC area, and then like Atlanta. Those are some big areas for it. But it was
Toronto, Canada.
Yeah, actually, we played some teams from Toronto. They were very lovely. It was frustrating for me watching them not getting taken seriously, and like some of these girls are like they played for junior worlds, like they're literally world champions and couldn't like get the respect that they deserved. And then that kind of contextualized a lot of experiences for me that I had as an athlete, playing Ultimate Frisbee and other sports, and then also like being a science major in college. And I was kind of like, there's something going on here that's not right. And that kind of got me into the whole gender equity, or jequity as the girls called it. And then obviously working at a sports and STEM camp, I saw more parallels with the experiences that our girls were kind of having. And I think what I always try and hammer home is that the wonderful thing about camp is that we all care so much about being inclusive and trying to make our camps the best place for any kid that walks through our doors. But when things like gender inequity and systemic sexism permeate our society, which I think is an undeniable fact, there's no way that our programs are immune to those effects. Like everybody is bringing in those implicit biases and those limiting ideas that we've learned about ourselves and each other into our programs. And we're not going to fix everything with summer camp, but we can make our spheres and our environments better and more welcoming for all of the kids that are coming through, despite what barriers we're kind of facing and outside of our camp bubble.
It's interesting. Sam, why don't you tell us how when you heard her Leslie speak, you found it so relevant, because she was all jazzed up from when she saw you. Sam saw Leslie at the Women in Camping Conference, just to plug those guys too.
Yes. Well, her coming from being a college athlete and some of those experiences, and then running this kind of camp, she's in the hotbed of everything. And she has some wonderful resources that I'm sure she'll tell us about, not only to check out your own biases. And I thought, of course, I don't have any biases. And then I take a couple of the tests and it's like, well, maybe I do in some areas. And then the one to check out your job descriptions and, some of the things Jenna was talking about as well, Leslie talked about too, about, watching how do you name your groups? How do you do your cabin? All of that kind of thing comes into play. So it just opened my eyes to a lot of, re-scrutinizing what I do and how I can make it better.
Right. So it's got to be interesting, Leslie, at a technology and sports camp, right? Where you would think it would be like a heavily male dominated kind of population. How do you recruit girls and female staff?
That is an excellent question. We actually are a heavily dominated camp when it comes to male campers and staff. So if you're looking for male staff, we might have some recommendations.
Yeah, shift to computers. Staff. Yeah.
Yes, and they're just very wonderful. Yeah.
Video game making.
Our staff are excellent, but it has been difficult, and part of the issue that we're seeing is when the girls are younger, like they're our youngest campers, we have a lot more female campers, and then as they age and these kind of like limiting ideas about themselves, and they are dropping out of STEM and athletics, not just at our camp but at school, it's a lot harder to recruit them as they get older. And then what I'm seeing is that our CIT programs, which I also run, are very low on girls. And that's because we don't have the campers aging up through our program to then be in those programs. And that is a significant part of our staff pool. So we're also not getting those like homegrown female applicants to our jobs. And that it's just like this whole cycle that has been very difficult for us. And we've tried multiple different things. We tried reserving half of our spots for female identifying and non-binary campers, I believe 2 summers ago, and it sort of helped a little bit, but not a significant amount, and was very logistically difficult. Probably the program that has done the most is the Grow Club, which is a club that meets during lunch twice a week. And it runs at all of our sites, and we have female identifying or non-binary staff members run this club. And the idea is that even though we only have 30% girls, if they have this community at our camp that's just for them, that they will feel heard and validated and more cared about, and will be more likely to return for continuing summers, because they feel like their interest in STEM and sports is being addressed and their ideas are being listened to. And that has received really great feedback. And we're it's only 2 years old, but we're kind of starting to see a little bit of a return on that. But it's definitely an uphill battle. And, you know, we're like a female owned and run company. Our founder was a female, our current executive director is a female. A lot of us, there's only 4 of us that work year round, but 3 of us are female. So even with, you know, that kind of background, we're still having a really difficult time, because we're fighting so much more than just what is happening at our own sites.
Right. So going back to your passion here about gender equity. So picture the typical person listening to this podcast, right? 1,000 people listening to this podcast, right? A lot of them are listening. They run camps. They would like to have more gender equity at their camp, and they just are looking for ideas and where to start, and what are some simple things that they're probably missing. Do you have any advice for these folks?
Absolutely. The number one thing is awareness. You have to start with yourself and become aware of all of the different ways that these inequities are being perpetuated in society and at your own camp. And I have a resource I can share that's actually a gender equity evaluation. And it's just like a starting point of things to consider about your camp in particular. Some of them might be relevant to your camp, some of them not so much, but just an idea of kind of giving you places where to kind of look and start and evaluate things. And then once you kind of have come to a little bit of awareness about things you might need to focus on, obviously bringing that to your team and just bringing everyone in on the conversation and getting these kinds of different perspectives. If you're a man, like, you should definitely feel empowered to do this and have these conversations. Just because you're a man doesn't mean that you can't make a change here. The most important thing is that we're educating each other as the managers, and like just admitting to ourselves, like, our camp might not be exactly where it should be. There's a lot of power in that, and making the intention to move forward. Then after that, the next step to me is staff. Staff is huge. Your staff training is so important. As I said, your staff are going to bring in, as wonderful as they are, all kinds of biases and things that they have learned over the years that they don't even realize that they've learned. So making sure that your staff training, and I have ideas about this too. I have a lot of thoughts on this.
Well, let's give a couple of nuggets.
Sure. So one of my favorite resources that Sam kind of mentioned is called Project Implicit. And it was created by Harvard, and it is a wonderful and terrifying series of tests where you like basically click on photo and word associations, and it lets you know like what kind of biases you have towards different types of people. So the one that I took that I thought was going to be easy was whether I associate women or men more with being a CEO or with being a homemaker. And I was like, easy peasy. I believe in gender equity. I literally own a business doing this. Like I'm going to be fine. And I heavily associated men with being CEOs and women with being homemakers. And I cried for 3 days. I picked myself up off the ground and like realized that I can do better. But like I think
30 years from now, it'll be different. Don't worry.
Hopefully we'll see.
Yeah. From what I'm seeing.
I mean, a lot of women were having this conversation 30 years ago too. So I don't know.
Probably.
But I think that that's a great thing to have your managers do. I think it's a great thing to have your staff do before they even show up, because then you're setting this tone for them. Like, hey, this is going to be a place where we unpack these kind of difficult things that we've internalized over the years, and you need to be ready to self-reflect and have these conversations. I think that's super important.
Yeah. And we'll get that information, those links and whatever resources you can give us, and we'll have it online on our page at daycamppodcast.com. All right. We have a show notes page for every single one of our shows. So just want to say that.
Great. Another thing that Sam also kind of touched on was I really like to talk about gender coded language, and that comes into play with job descriptions, but it also just comes into play with how your staff generally interact and talk to each other. Gender coded language it's like when words associate with a feminine or a masculine idea, basically. So a lot of adjectives that we use to describe counselors or just people in general have some sort of masculine or feminine connotation to them. So feminine coded words tend to be words like caring and compassionate and team player, very amenable, team-based, team-oriented kind of words. Whereas male coded words tend to be like autonomous, independent, aggressive, ambitious, like these like power words about, you know, going for number one and, you know, just generally like getting things done kind of stuff. And the point is to make the staff aware of these words and how they're using them with their campers. Like, are they praising their female campers like, oh, you were so caring, you're such a great friend, and then they're praising male campers for like, oh, you're such a good leader on the team, you know, like those things are fine to say, there's nothing wrong with saying that, but is that the only thing that you're telling those kids? Like, are you praising your male campers for being really great friends and for, you know, being emotionally vulnerable and showing their feelings, and are you praising your female campers for being great leaders on the team and for, you know, stepping up and getting things done when they need to be done?
So about 10 years ago, I did some consulting for a new camp called Eden Village, the sleepaway camp. And they're very big on social justice and gender equity and all that kind of things. Super awesome people. And one of the things that because, you know, they started a camp, they can do whatever they want, was no body talk. They weren't allowed to make references to how people's appearance was, right? And, you know, like you said, when people come into your program, they come with all this stuff that they've been trained to do, like dogs, right, over the years. And I tried to bring it back to my camp. And you realize how almost everyone, male or female, when they see a little cute little girl, they basically tell her she's a cute little girl in some ways, right? And they're doing it because they think it's a compliment, but it's weird. And it's one of these things that's so hard to break, that code that people have, and raising awareness about it and getting people to understand that they're doing it, you know, is such a great thing to be able to do during staff training.
I have a good example from the Women in Camp conference. When I got the Dare to Lead award, my female boss announced it to everybody that I got the Dare to Care award. And I was like, okay, I know she meant it as a compliment, but it turns the whole idea of what it was completely around. So you know, just had to be careful of the language.
Oh my gosh, that's awesome.
And Andy, I would also add that, you know, to Leslie's point from earlier, there needs to be this understanding that it starts from the top, and also that the language you're using from the beginning of when you meet someone is extremely important. So we talk to our counselors a lot about using children's names, much, much more so than any other descriptive, you know, instead of, hey guys, hey girls.
Hey sweetie.
Well, that's
but I know, but I hear people say it sometimes.
Sweetie, sweetie, not a choice.
Right.
But you referring to children by their name and the name that they want to be called. We have a lot of kids who go by nicknames. And so asking them on the first day of camp or even at the family open house, you know, how do you like to be called? What's the name that you use at home and things like that. And consistently reminding counselors to be addressing the children that way. The same is true when we think about examples that we give during staff training about stories or about case studies or any of the learning that we do, to make sure that we're being consistently equitable in sharing the concept and the type of story. So if we're talking about something that could be stereotypically construed as a male concept, idea, or storyline, blatantly making it a female who's the primary character, and vice versa, so that they're not ever thinking only along those one lines. Now, realistically, they come into camp for 8 weeks, 9 weeks with orientation and training. We can't change a lifetime, but helping them think through these things from the beginning of the summer and not mid-course correcting is also really important.
Yeah, you chip away at it, right? It's self-awareness. And I have to say that the more self-awareness when you start having transgender kids, transgender staff, non-binary people at your camp, because then you catch yourself constantly, right? And in a way that has helped people in general, I think at my camp, speaking for my camp specifically, in catching themselves doing those things.
Absolutely.
Right. All right. So let's talk a little bit about that. Let's talk about kids first. Let's talk about transgender, non-binary kids in camp and assimilating them. And I'm going to go to our two guests first. So any kind of things that you've seen that can make things easier for these kids as they come in?
I'll jump in unless Leslie has something to start with. So, I mean, I think it goes back to my original concept earlier, which is that children are children, people are people, and we don't look at them first as their gender or how they present physically, but rather, you know, their interests, their excitement, their wants, their willingness, the thing that they most want to do at camp. And we get to the gender piece later. There's no question it does come up. I would say, you know, for me, with the first time that we encountered a transgender child, I was most concerned about the conversation with my staff and then with the other parents of the children in that group. And in both cases, I was pleasantly surprised that that was actually not an issue at all. That, you know, the level of awareness in each of those groups was tremendous, and their sort of excitement in the fact that we were open to everyone, and that it was emblematic of our inclusion of every kind of person.
Right. And going back to, you know, all schools are co-ed, right? All schools have plenty of transgender, non-binary kids nowadays, right? So let's just count our blessings that we're not a sleepaway camp, you know, a resident camp, because it makes it a lot easier being a day camp.
Well, there are things that we deal with that overnight camps are not dealing with, and there are things that they deal with that we're not dealing with. Right. You know, I always talk to overnight camp director friends, and they say, I'm so essentially jealous that we don't have to deal with beds and all the things that happen in beds. And I say to them, I'm just glad that, you know, we have the pleasure of dealing with buses every day instead. So we all have our stuff.
And parents at night, right?
All day long too.
Any thoughts from you, Leslie, about transgender kids at camp?
I can't say that we've had any serious issues that I've known of with campers, even if they came to camp one summer identifying one way and came to camp the next summer identifying a different way. I found that kids are way cooler than adults about this. Yeah, like they don't care.
Oh yeah, they're super accepting.
Yeah, and we just make sure all our facilities.
Right. One of the things that I always wonder about these kids, and we've had a few at our camp, is like how upfront should you be with the counselors and with, you know, when kids bring it up, and how do those conversations go, right, in training the staff, so that when a kid says, hey, you know, what's the deal with this Johnny over here, you know, like giving the counselors the tools to be able to talk about that, or directing them to someone who can have an eloquent conversation about it, right? Because it can be very difficult. It can be very challenging, and they could sort of mess up and make things worse unintentionally. That's what I worry about.
I think it's certainly a valid concern. Perhaps, though, no different than a child who has a tick, or who has any other perhaps
thing that's different. A difference. Yeah.
But specifically something that you can't see when the child walks into camp for the first time, you know, any sort of disability or special need that may not be obvious. The same thing, that's the same skill we're teaching our counselors, hopefully during orientation, to work with any child, which is that you don't know everything about everyone. the minute they first walk into their group. They don't always present with the things that you may need to know or want to know. And something might come up week 6 that you're 100% not prepared for. And hopefully we're teaching them those things throughout the summer as well, that they can navigate, and they can lean on their unit heads, or camper care or other teams in camp. I think sometimes the biggest piece is having the right teams to support them, because you can't necessarily anticipate every single thing that's going to come up, but having those resources available in camp, and teaching them who to go to for what, is perhaps more important than every counselor having the right answer.
I love that idea. We have we've had kids. We have had a few kids over the years. Not a significant no significant issues or situations that I can bring up, but we do treat them sort of with our camper relations team, we call them. They deal with kids with special needs and kids with different language issues, whether it be like foreign language speakers or kids who are developmentally delayed, things like that. They all fall under the umbrella of this camper relations team, and so they work hard to be as discreet as possible, but to be able to jump in when things are not going as smoothly as possible, but also to be able to provide the staff with the tools that are that are needed to be aware and to treat these kids as equals. So I'm glad you made that point, because I like that approach.
Yeah, and similar to kids with special needs, I think that a lot of older camp directors don't understand the way of the world now. That the fact is that kids are used to this. They're used to kids with special needs in their class. They're used to transgender kids in their class, right? Maybe a 56-year-old camp director isn't used to it per se, but that's just the way it is, right? And it is all inclusion, whether like Erin's saying, kids that speak a foreign language, like whatever. They're just kids that just need a little attention, a little help, a little support in whatever it is, whether it's emotional support or literally like physical support, helping them go to the bathroom or whatever. I got interviewed a year ago by a local parenting magazine. They wanted to know how I was dealing with transgender kids at my camp. And I framed the entire conversation as inclusion. Like, we're here to support every single kid and whatever additional support they need. And they said, oh, can we speak to any of the parents of the non-transgender kids, right? Of the regular biologically gendered kids. I want to see what their reaction was of having their kid in a group with transgender kids. And I said, I will give you some names, but I guarantee they won't even know that their kid was in a group with transgender kids, because their kid's not even going to talk about it. And lo and behold, that's exactly what happened. They called these parents up, and these parents were like, what? Like, my daughter never mentioned anything to me about this. Of course not, because this is just another day at camp or another day at school for these kids, right?
Yes, and I think sometimes it's helpful for all of us to know what we don't know, and where we need our own resources, or when we need to call in for support or understanding. We've had the pleasure of working with a couple of large organizations that have helped us think through, what does it look like when we think about like vision versus practice. It's very easy in the off season, especially, to say it's all of them are the same. Every kid is a kid. We don't have any issues. We're just going to, incorporate them into our groups, and that'll be that. Realistically, when it comes to the practice, and especially once camp starts, there are certainly conversations that are more difficult or challenging that we don't anticipate either from a camper or a staff person or a parent. And knowing who to call in those moments as a director is also really important. Obviously, I try to teach my staff who they can lean on in camp, but I've had to learn who I can lean on outside of camp to talk through some of these pieces and figure out what is the language we should be using, how should we be introducing the concept to other families in the group, if at all, and what are best practices nationwide and worldwide in navigating some of these more difficult conversations that in an urban environment and in a more liberal environment are certainly coming to life much faster, but are certainly springing up around the world and need to be navigated with the same tenderness and care that we would want to talk about anything that's affecting the child throughout the summer.
So Leslie, when you're consulting, have you run into questions from organizations that you work with along these lines?
A little bit. Not quite as often as the male-female dynamic aspect of things. But with my staff, I really do like to give them basically a list of definitions. I certainly did not learn about all of the different ways that you can be besides male or female. Like when I was going through family life, when I was in elementary school, like we didn't learn about that. I had to go find that information for myself. And I think helping staff understand the difference between gender identity and gender expression and assigned sex, and that being intersex is a thing, and that's different than being transgender, helping them understand that there are so many different shades and that it is based in science. A lot of it, like you don't necessarily have an XX or an XY chromosome. It's not all black and white. Helping them understand that has been really instrumental in making sure that they are kind of checking their own biases when it comes to working with kids who don't necessarily fit into that gender binary. And that's something I'm 29, and that's just something that I didn't really grow up with. And that has really only come to light recently for, I think, a lot of people my age. So I think that having that very specific language and that education aspect is really, really important.
Interesting. So is it fair to say that my three lady friends here, with your non-gender specific groups, that having transgender staff is not much of an issue then, right? Because we got all these co-ed groups and all that kind of thing, because as a guy that most of my camp groups, I have some co-ed groups, but most of them are gender specific. I've had transgender staff now where I've had transgender male in a male group with another male co-counselor, and it worked out fine. It was excellent. It was just a matter of like keeping the gossipy kind of stuff under wraps,
The biggest issue we had with a transgender staff, and this guy was great. It was great to have him, and he worked for us for many years. But he had just transitioned right before he started with us that summer, and he was sort of estranged from some of his relatives, and his cousin and his cousin, who was a young child, found herself in, sort of for the first time interacting with the staff member. And let's just say the parents were not, understanding of, the situation, and made it difficult for us. It was hard on this staff member, but that was an issue that we had to deal with, was that, the kid was very accepting. I mean, the child called the staff member by the original name, the female name that the staff member used to go by, and was corrected quickly, and the kid kind of, let it go and was great. And then the parents came in and started making a big fuss about it. So, that was, something that, I don't know how, commonplace that kind of a situation is. It was a very unique situation, but,
there's a lot of emotional stuff, stuff, and especially when it's kids or young staff. They may present as having a lot of confidence, but there's a lot of emotional stuff in there that they're going to need some support to be able to navigate the waters. I've had friends who have had day camps, where they've hired transgender staff who were campers under a different gender, and then I had one friend who hired a female, and at orientation, it was a male. Kind of thing happened in between the hiring and the first day of orientation. So it's like anything's on the table nowadays. And like Jenna had said prior, when you have co-ed groups, it really makes things so much easier in this realm.
Right. So I would, sorry.
That's okay.
The only thing I would simply add is that all staff come with all kinds of stuff. Mm-hmm. They come with the relative baggage of however old they are, and their family structure and schooling and stress and all of the things that like create a 17 to 25-year-old these days. And this is but one of the things that they come with as baggage sometimes. And we have to navigate it the same way we would any other difficulty. It's not to say that having co-ed groups means having transgender staff is simple and easy. There are certain things that certainly come up that we work through and talk through both pre-season with them and with the rest of our team, and then also throughout the summer. You're dealing with the biases also of other staff. And what does it mean to have a co-counselor who you may not agree with or don't understand the things that they're going through, and how do you help them navigate those things? And I think, those are pieces that are unique to each situation and each camp, and how much of our work is about helping our staff sort of figure themselves out and like work through, this entry into adulthood, and how much of our work is about focusing them on their work. And I think the balance is certainly interesting. But there are certainly struggles that come up. Where to place them and who they work with is not the struggle, but the other pieces certainly are difficult, or can be difficult throughout the summer.
Right.
And I think our children, if we get the children to get to know each other, the children are more apt to go, oh, that's Danny, or, oh, that's Sally. And once they know someone, they can forgive everything because they know you and they've got it now.
Yeah. It's like fear of the unknown. Right.
Yeah.
And I think Leslie said it earlier, kids are much more adept at dealing with all of these things, and much more willing and open-minded than any of us. And it hopefully will only improve, sort of interpersonal pieces as people get older. But children are certainly the most forgiving of any of these pieces.
Right. All right. Well, we're running out of time, folks. It was a heck of a conversation. So what we usually do, Leslie and Jenna, at this point is we do a day camp tip of the week. Right. So if you have one, you guys will go last. All right. I got a good one. I'm going to go first. All right. Something that people can take back with them and potentially use this summer at minimal cost or no cost if you're Sam. And mine is no cost today too. Okay.
Good deal.
All right. We're coming up on the 2020 presidential campaign, as we all know. And we did this back in 2016 and it was a huge hit. All right. So we call it Camp-Paign, P-A-I-G-N, right? 2020. And we came up with positions like, like sort of made up. We have the president of the puppies because we have camp dogs. We have the lieutenant of the lake or something like that. Like we have these positions, speaker of the stage. And we, the camp's broken into divisions so that we have divisional primaries, right? So they nominate, they have a nominating process, and then they have primaries, and they have to go up there and explain what they're going to do and tell about themselves and the changes they're going to make and what are they going to do as the president of the puppies and that kind of thing, right? And then each division has one person for each one of those like 4 or 5 roles, right? And then we have a big all camp assembly one morning, and we actually put up stumps, like tree stumps, and each kid goes up and does a stump speech. All right. Like a 30-second to a minute stump speech of what they're going to do. So here are these 8-year-olds in front of like hundreds of kids with a microphone saying how they're going to do these great things. It is unbelievably cute. And it's giving them amazing confidence to be able to speak in front of everybody and everybody watching like in awe as this little kid has the guts to do this kind of thing. And then we vote and then we have a winner, and they get to walk around, with like a little sash, for the rest of the summer that they're the president of the puppies or whatever. And like I said, 0 cost,
Awesome.
Teaching great leadership skills, public speaking, right? And it's just a great lead by example kind of thing. So Camp-Paign 2020.
Nice.
That's mine. All right, Sam.
All right. I'm doing another art one this time. Instead of regular tie-dye, I'm doing negative space tie-dye. So instead of a white shirt and you're using colored dye, you take a colored shirt and you do bleach water and spray bottles. And you lay out the t-shirts and they can design the white that's going to be on their colored shirt. So pretty cheap.
Great.
You just have to have the conversation about don't spray each other
Right.
and all of that.
Yeah, it looks particularly good on a black shirt, I have to say. I have a couple of those. All right, Sam, you got one? I'm sorry, Aaron, you got one?
I do. So first of all, let me just, I just wanted to say something about at the beginning, we were talking about Robin Hood being started in the 50s. It actually started in the 60s. Sorry, in the 40s.
The 40s.
The 40s were the oldest private day camp in Canada. So, making these kinds of changes, for us is, we've always been progressive in many ways, but our names and things like that are very traditional. So we're working hard to come up with solutions to to make everyone feel comfortable, the alumni that send their kids to camp and all that stuff. So,
well, Aaron, give them an example of what you're talking about, your group names, because I think that's pretty interesting.
Yeah, we have, so Camp Robin Hood was started, the name came from the camp being in Sherwood Park in Toronto, and they thought, okay, Sherwood Park, Robin Hood, it makes sense. And then we came up with that theme and progressed from that point on. And so two of our male units are the archers and the jousters, and our female units are the lasses and the maidens, and obviously very gender specific. Intermediate boys, intermediate girls are pretty standard for many camps that are separated. And then we have our co-ed, sort of semi-co-ed senior unit. So so we're working on some stuff, but our sports camp, since we've sort of evolved it about 20 years ago, has always been co-ed in both the groups and the makeup of the program. So we're working to take some of those aspects and bring it into our regular camp and just figure out a way to honor the traditions and the history without changing, with being progressive, I should say. So, the activity that I'm going to mention today, not really specific to this, but what I've done many times for our staff is created these question cards as an icebreaker activity, and we put pertinent issues on the question cards and get people to go around in a very informal, very threatening kind of way, talking to one person at a time and just asking these questions. And we throw some easy ones in there. After they ask the one question, they switch cards with the person that they're sharing the question and answer with. And then, a couple of really, more difficult questions are thrown in there. And so when issues, that are important to us, coming up with solutions for, changing the makeup of our camp or the history of our camp in some way. This would be a good forum to, kind of have that discussion with the staff and figure out their feelings on some of these gender issues and look to the staff. We always look to the staff to find out how to, move forward and do things differently. And so that this gives us a more informal way, I guess, of dealing with some pretty heavy material, somewhat heavy material.
Yeah, no, it's a great idea. One thing that we did in regards to that is we put a little mailbox outside the office so people could just drop a note in there at any time, not have to go through some official means kind of thing, like sort of inconspicuously just drop it in there.
The suggestion box.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. All right, Leslie, got anything?
You betcha. So keeping with the gender equity theme, one of my favorite activities that I've done in the Grow Club that I think could be used at camps is called Myths versus Facts. And I take common stereotypes about women or girls, like girls don't like sports, or biologically speaking, girls aren't as good at math and science as boys. And I give different groups of girls those stereotypes based on their age group. And then I give them a bunch of statistics about why those stereotypes aren't true. Like scientifically, I'm empowering kids with statistics, one girl at a time. So for girls don't like sports, I have statistics like actually 40% of athletes are female, but only 4% of media coverage is about women's sports. Like, what does that do? What do you think that does? Or biologically, girls aren't as good at science and math. I give, them the research studies that have come out recently about how cognitively speaking, our brains are actually the same pretty much. So using those actual hard facts so that when they encounter those stereotypes, which they do often, they actually have hard science to be nah, actually that's just not true. And I think that is really empowering. And the same day that we did that activity, 2 different girls came up to me and were like, I already used my statistic that you gave me. One of them used it so that she could be the goalie while they were playing handball. And I was like, that's awesome. And we had a high five and it was great.
Well, if you want to help girls hundreds or thousands at a time, upload those statistics to Day Camp Podcast so that we can play this little game with the kids, because it's a cool idea. It's great. All right, Jenny, you're bringing it home.
Sure. So mine is not actually about gender. So we do something with our oldest campers called Leave Your Mark, where for the first 3 weeks of each session, they figure out a time and place in camp where they want to leave their mark. It needs to be something that is, it can be something that's permanent. It can be something that is sort of indicative of their friendships, of their group, of their relationships. It can be specific to a value that we celebrate at camp. Or it can be unique to their group in some way. And then the last week of camp, or of each session, they do the leaving of their mark, either the creation of something or this past summer it was a time capsule. So there was a lot of work around building the capsule and putting things in and then finding the right place to dig. And they took the youngest group with them to where they were digging. They dug it, they put it in, they told the youngest group about it and asked if the youngest group would mind when they were the oldest to pull it out and to learn a little bit more about their group. And what we realized was it's very likely that most of those kids, if not many of those kids, will be counselors for their first time that summer. When the youngest are then the oldest, and that they could probably be digging it out with them. But it's a great way for us as a relatively young camp to start to build some traditions with our kids, and for our campers to feel a sense of kind of responsibility and ownership for the experience that they're having and that potentially the next set of kids will have as well.
I'm going to put you on the spot, Jenna, and you can pass on this if you want. But okay. Having been to your camp, one of the things that I left with that is very unique and beautiful and is sort of similar in spirit to what you're saying is the Satoga moments. Sure. So can you talk about that with these folks? Because I think it's wonderful.
So a Satoga moment is, this concept started from a Jewish blessing, Shehechianu, which is something that we say for something that is new or you haven't done in over a year or is special or unique to a circumstance. And what we realized when starting to think about opening a new camp was that much of what we would be experiencing was new and required some element of marking the moment and potentially blessing as well. And so we came up with this concept of Satoga moments. And there's a huge board just at the entranceway to camp, which says Satoga moment on it. And there are cards that the children can either draw on, write on, or have a counselor help them with that says my Satoga moment and a place for their name, and then they write it out and they go on the board. We keep cards everywhere in camp, in the lunchroom, in the changing rooms, at the playground, at the board, obviously, but literally everywhere. Counselors keep them in their backpacks so that when something happens, and it could be as often as someone kicking a goal at soccer, which honestly does happen every day, or something as unique as, a particular special event and a child's opportunity to get up on stage. But really it was a chance for us to help the kids notice these moments, to notice that things happen every day that make them excited and feel blessed. And a chance for the camp community to celebrate them. So we gather around the board pretty regularly to look to see what new moment has been hung up or what new concept has made it to the board. Sometimes there's a lot of Gaga that makes it to the board, and so we find something that's not Gaga related. But it really has become a pretty remarkable tradition. The kids send us their Satoga moments during the winter. We get tons of email from parents with copies of Satoga moments that they've written at home or that they've experienced. And it's been a really lovely tradition that started when we opened in the new space and has only grown.
Yeah. I mean, whatever you guys are thinking, my listeners, whatever you guys are thinking about this and you think it's a cool idea, like having seen the boards myself, it's really awesome. It's really magical. And it really, it pushes the idea of appreciation, number one, but also trying new things. Right. Of motivating people to try new things. And it's just, it materializes it, right? It's just intentionality, and it's just super and great. So thank you, Jenna. Thank you, Leslie. Thank you, Aaron and Sam, as always. And we want to thank our Go Camp Pro executive producer, Travis Allison, our producer, Matt Hansberger, and our dedicated sponsors, ACA New York, New Jersey, Commercial Recreation Specialists, and AM Skyer for allowing us to bring this podcast to you. If you don't want to miss an episode of the Day Camp Pod, you should subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, SoundCloud, or Google, and give us a nice rating while you're at it. Check out our show notes from this and other episodes at daycamppodcast.com, and feel free to send us some feedback on new ideas and future pods, and our email address is daycampquestions@gocamp.pro. Thanks for listening and making yourself a better day camp professional. We'll be back in 2 weeks with another episode of the Day Camp Pod. All right. Thank you, everybody.
Well done. Thank you.
Thank you. And if you have resources, send them to Matt and he'll get them on the show notes for us.
Awesome.
All the
Awesome.
websites and stuff.
Thank you very much.
Great. Have a good
Have
night.
a great
everybody.
evening. Thanks for sharing, everybody.
Thank you.
Great.
Aaron and Sam will be in touch about the next one. Okay.
Sounds good.
Sounds good.
All right.
Andy,
Talk to you-
like the new configuration of your office, by the way.
A little more feng shui I got. But,
I like that the window, the beach behind you.
oh, that's
great.
my wife. That's as close as my wife gets to the beach in the summer, unfortunately. You're a camp director.
Amazing.
All right. I'll talk to you soon,
Take
guys.
care, guys.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, Leslie.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thanks, Les.
Bye.